Awesome. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Doing great. How about yourself, Katie?
Doing pretty good. It's a nice sunny day out here, but even more than the weather, I'm excited to talk to you about your experience as a .NET hiring manager and really learn from you throughout this session.
Great.
So just to kick things off before I get into my list of questions here, could you give me a bit of an introduction as to your role, what you do, as well as your experience as a hiring manager?
Absolutely. Right. So my name is Jeff Schwartz, as you mentioned, Katie. I'm currently a software engineering manager at Microsoft. But before I got there, I graduated from University of Texas at Austin. So go Longhorns. And that's back in the old Taylor building as opposed to those new fancy buildings that we have now. Then right out of school, moved up to Washington to join Microsoft here in the Redmond area. Outside of work, love the outdoors. Love to, we're so close to the ocean, so close to the mountains, love swimming, kayaking, always a wetsuit because it's really cold in the ocean. Love hiking up in the mountains. And then as far as my role at Microsoft, so I've been here just a little bit over 22 years. I'm the engineering manager for the .NET runtime. So that's the core virtual machine that powers C#. That's the garbage collector, type system, code generators. And for the 22 years, I think about 15 years, I've been a people manager, which means I've been a hiring manager for that amount of time. And for about 12 of those years, I've been what's called an as appropriate or a decision maker on interview loops.
Okay, interesting. So first off, you gave me a lot of information to work with. So you mentioned your 22-year tenure here. Have you been using C# and .NET that whole time?
That's a really funny question. So I've been on the runtime in various capacities my entire career. I was a tester for a while. I was a customer advocate. I looked at the data aspects of .NET. And then for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been in the engineering role on the .NET runtime team. The reason I find that question funny is for the first 2 years or so, I was only MSIL. I was way down in the bowels of the runtime. But for majority of the 22 years, yes, a lot of C#, VB, F#, all the .NET languages.
Okay, interesting. So a little bit all over the place, but to get into kind of your experience as a hiring manager, you mentioned you've been doing it for 15 years. So I'm sure the process has changed a lot. But can you describe kind of specifically what types of candidates you're hiring? Do you hire early in career, later, across the board? Is it mainly for a specific type of role, or can you get into that a bit?
Absolutely. So I'm very passionate about interviewing, and I do it as much as my calendar will allow me. And there are lots of different kinds of events at Microsoft. We definitely have what we call early in profession, which is kind of the first year either at a university or your second career. That's kind of that early. And we do events, and I've been participating in those. We have what we call industry hiring, which is more specific for a very particular role, like a role on my team or a role kind of in a .NET group across Microsoft. And then we have specific events at Microsoft for various groups of like going to conferences and, Grace Hopper or et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of different ways to be considered for a role at Microsoft.
Okay. I think I'm kind of guessing here based on who this event is for that we're going to get a lot of folks in that first early in profession bucket,
right.
Which is awesome. So I'm wondering, what does the hiring process, what can somebody expect when they go into that? And I will kind of caveat this, give a little disclaimer. This is based on Jeff's experience as somebody hiring at Microsoft. So this may differ company to company, year to year, but I just wanted to get a general rundown of what that looks like.
That's really great. And actually, I'll tell a quick personal story because as I mentioned, I actually came right out of college to Microsoft. And so the process is fairly similar to what it was 20 odd years ago when I went through it. For me personally, I was at a recruiting events for ACM. I have a bachelor's in computer science. And at that event, it was like a breakfast. I ended up handing my resume, presumably to a recruiter or an engineer at Microsoft. And then I had an on-campus screening where I went through technical questions, and then I flew out and had a full-time interview, and then I got the offer. And so it's a very similar process that you would expect. these days, probably you're applying to the rec. We have various ones open, remote only, US, across the world. And then from there are recruiters that would end up screening resumes. You get a call just to make sure kind of logistics work out. Most interviews now are virtual. So you get to do it in your own house. You get to actually use a real editor for code questions and no longer have to do it on the whiteboard, which is great. And then the process there, you probably meet two to four interviewers. The great thing about Microsoft is that we actually make decisions same day coming out of those. And then the candidates, as a candidate, you probably find out within about a week or two.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely reflects. I had a very similar experience starting as a university intern. And I remember going through those steps. I did it virtually. Actually, when I did it, I was in Notebook. So it was a little kooky, but it was a very interesting process. So it's cool that it's kind of remained similar. So being on the hiring side, where in that process do you come into play?
That's a really good point. So I have been involved in all the parts. So like to a limited extent on the sourcing side, as I mentioned, definitely screening resumes, interviewing. As I mentioned, I definitely enjoy doing that. And my role as an as appropriate or a decision maker help to drive the debrief process, which is where you get to have multiple opinions in the room to make sure we're making good hires. And then all the way through being a business contact, which is if you're, get extended an offer, you have one of the engineers or a member of Microsoft that is then part of your process to answer questions, be there for you as you start to get closer to making a decision, and then eventually when you get closer to your start date. So I've been kind of in part of all the process of hiring.
Oh, wow. And to the extent you're able to share, I know I always hear a lot of questions about kind of what am I expected to know and show off during this process? Do I need to know a specific language or technology, or are there certain other skills I should be prepared to showcase? Can you talk through that a bit?
Absolutely. It's a strength of Microsoft that we do core competency based hiring. And so core competencies could be like technical excellence or customer focus or adaptability. And there are a set of questions and guidance that we have about helping to assess candidates based on that. And as I mentioned in my role as AA, we're trying to help make sure that there's a fairly level or an equal footing as far as how to evaluate these things. But at the same time, we also have the creativity, and a lot of people are involved in the interviewing process. And so for me personally, I can answer my expectations of specific things that people need to have in interviews, but it'll vary slightly, depending on who you get to meet, kind of the role that perhaps you're going for. But there are very few specific things that I expect from an interview in a candidate when we get to meet them. I mean, definitely have to pick a language, and it does not have to be a .NET language to be going for a .NET role, but you have to be able to express your ideas in code. And so, every once in a while, you may kind of find that there's, on the technical side, questions that are, well suited for a particular data type or an algorithm. So definitely worthwhile to brush up on, how tree traversals work and, common things that you may see in computer science. But generally speaking, the thing that we're looking for is, candidates to ask really good questions, have a collaborative nature. So you could be presented with a problem and perhaps the interviewer will provide some context and you ask some questions, they ask a little more context, and you start building and you're actually building together. And so there's no specific thing necessary often to answer those kind of questions. And the other thing to keep in mind is, particularly on the technical side, 45-minute interview is pretty typical. And so really the technical question is only 20 minutes. And so the kind of questions that we ask should be understandable and solvable in that time frame. So there's no tricks. In general, there's multiple solutions. And so as long as you're kind of taking the guide of the interviewer, I think that can kind of be solved that way.
Wow, I'm really interested in your answer because I feel like that kind of differs from my impression and things I hear among early in profession folks. Like they're very worried about the technical pieces, and I remember when I was going through that process, it wasn't communicated to me that it is a collaborative process and it's okay to ask questions. And in fact, it sounds like that's something you would encourage.
It's actually expected. Oftentimes, questions will be presented in a very ambiguous way, and without questions, you would either solve the wrong problem or you would be stuck. And so
Yeah.
you have to ask.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so based on that, we're also going to be talking to an early in profession person as well. So I'll definitely be
Mhm.
getting some insights from her about this. But do you have any recommendations for
Mhm.
how candidates should prepare for these types of interviews?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And particularly, there are really two kinds of questions that we ask in interviews. I'm focusing a little bit on the technical side as an engineer, but hopefully a little bit later we can talk a little bit about the more competency-based ones as well. But as I mentioned, with the technical side, clearly, brushing up on, the core algorithms, data structures, always useful because it helps you ask the right questions to the interviewer. Like I said, there's no particular thing that I would expect, but if you get asked a question, that has like a graph or something else, a tree structure, and you may not be as brushed up or familiar with like a depth first search, it would help to help kind of give you the right kind of insight that you should go after. But I have a couple high level things that I would recommend to all candidates, and often I will tell kind of candidates as I'm interviewing the following. So it's not like a secret because it really the interviewer and the candidate want the same thing. We want everyone to be successful, and we want to see people in their best light. So a couple things, particularly for technical questions, really nailing the details, getting that attention to detail and demonstrating that you can connect the dots and flow and track all of the necessary details of the technical problem from start to finish, super important. Breaking down the larger problem into smaller problems and solving them individually and then bringing it back together. Good validation at the end. Not only demonstrating that you can solve a problem, but you have the kind of creativity of like how to make sure you find all the corners. I mentioned asking lots of really good questions, super important. And then also, it's a different style thing, but talking through as you're thinking is super important. And it's totally okay to tell the interviewer, like, I just need a minute to think. That's okay. But try to avoid those kind of quiet periods where the interviewer can't quite track what you're doing because they can't help.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a super important one because, you can be working away at
Mhm.
this quote unquote whiteboard problem, but if the interviewer doesn't know what's going on, then they can't properly assess how
Right.
it's
Or help.
going.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So before I get into the core
Mhm.
competencies, one other question that has kind of been burning in my mind is, especially with regards to technical pieces,
Mhm.
what other things do you look for either in someone's resume or maybe
Mm.
portfolio that would help them be kind of a successful candidate in your mind?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Resumes for me, I love looking at resumes to go find questions. They're like hooks. And so I don't have like a specific set of things. I mean, clearly it's not like a school, it's not a GPA, it's not a language that it's not a class that you took. It's a hook so that I can ask a question. And so offering things on there that you want to talk about, that you have some depth to, maybe it demonstrated like a learning that you've now applied in somewhere else. Those are the kind of things that I look at resumes for. It's a kind of a good conversation starter.
Yeah. I kind of remember in my time looking for jobs, I used to go through this exercise where I would kind of do what you're describing. I would go
Mhm.
through my resume and
Mhm.
think of kind of the top points that I would
Right.
want to talk about associated with each of those items.
That's great. That's good prep.
Glad I would be a good candidate.
Already higher.
Yeah. So getting kind of into the I think you call them core concept side of things.
They're core
Can you
competencies. That's right.
competencies? Can you talk
Mhm.
through that a little more with me and describe what that is and what you look for?
Absolutely. This is, and being an engineer, this kind of often referred to as like the soft skill questions. Like, do
Mm,
we ask soft skill questions? We do. And examples again of core competencies that we use at Microsoft are like collaboration, drive for results, adaptability, and there are a set of criteria that we as Microsoft think are necessary to be an effective engineer and/or employee at Microsoft. And back to the piece we were talking about with being collaborative in an interview, like it is very rare that you get asked to do a problem and you're told you can't talk to anybody. Just go figure it out. Like here's a whiteboard, just go figure it out. So that collaborative piece is actually really important. Like demonstrating that not only can you ask good questions to help decompose the problem, But when presented with a conversation, either a hint or, just talking it through, that you've stopped, you reflected, you heard what they said, and you can demonstrate that you're building on ideas of other people is actually really important. So that was kind of a really concrete example. But there could be other ones, like an example of one looking for adaptability could be, walk me through a time, when you had a conflict with a teammate, how did you resolve it? And it just helps to show kind of the depth and how you think about problems, and kind of, from a past experience, you can tell a story. And just a couple, pieces of advice there. Oftentimes we think of interviews as being like the interview gets to ask all the questions. And so they have kind of, in essence, have driven the conversation. But I look at it almost as a partnership, because not only does the interview get to ask the question, but the candidate then gets to choose what they say. And I love it when you answer one of these soft skill questions by answering the question, for sure. Back to tell me a time where you had a teammate that was a challenge. But you can choose the story and you can add something that's like a hook for the next question, that may be the thing that the interviewer really finds exciting. You could say, yeah, we were partnering on this thing, and, through this conflict, I actually found out that their passion area was somewhere else. And we ended up building a club together. Like, wow, not only did you have a problem, you showed how you demonstrated it, but now you've given me this other thing that I should ask a question about. And so you get to choose kind of the stories you tell, with those kind of things in mind. You can kind of help them build the story that you want to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Like, how can you kind of work with your interviewer to not just answer their questions, but also talk about what you want to talk about and thinks highlights the best kind of parts of you. That's awesome.
Yep. And I have a similar kind of a couple, pieces of advice to give people when they're answering soft questions.
Ooh, please.
Right. So the big one, there's a couple of big ones. There's only, I guess, 3, but they're fairly large. Definitely balance concise versus verbose. There is a too much when you're answering these kind of questions, because it's a pretty limited amount of time, but there's also a too little. Always start with the story and the context before getting to the specific. You have to kind of set up the story so that the interviewer can follow along. And then the last one's probably the most important. When telling stories, particularly about teams, be very specific and intentional about we's versus I's. Like, we did things, which is great. And I think we should be collaborative and demonstrate team. But then very specifically point out the part that you contributed, because that's kind of what the interviewer wants to know, both the parts that you did, but then also the parts that you did together.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great piece of advice. I wish I had heard that before all of my interviews back in the day. So we're quickly coming towards the end of our time. So I have one more question for you, and then I'd love to open it up to what I may have missed. But first, I did get this question actually from one of our Microsoft student ambassadors, and they mentioned that they're having a bit of uncertainty about future software engineering jobs and what expectations they are going to be put upon them, basically. So I'm wondering, what expectations do you have of somebody who's a early in profession engineer joining your team?
It's a really good question. I mean, we are sitting at the precipice of AI generative technology. Clearly, these models can write code pretty proficiently, and they can debug code. And there's going to be a lot of really interesting creative growth, and particularly for Microsoft. I think we're on the forefront of writing the tools that do that kind of work. And so I think, if I look at one subtext of that question of do I have a job, 5-10 years from now? I think the answer is yes. There will always be a place for, highly skilled humans to be in this loop, either building the tools that leverage these kind of models, or just the kind of work isn't well suited for that. And then the other part of the question of what do I expect? Any new hire that comes in, particularly early in profession, they have a couple people at least that are really there as their advocates. Their manager, asking questions, making sure that the manager is aware of kind of where they're at, how they're thinking, and then we always offer an onboarding buddy. And that's the person that if you're not talking to them every day, you're probably not doing something right. You really should overload them with just all the questions, make sure you remain unblocked, keep going. And a lot of the spaces are, big and complex. The kind of problems that we solve at Microsoft are definitely super important. So they're not something that you can pick up overnight. 6, 12 months to get ramped up on a team is not atypical. And we afford you time to learn on the job, start off small projects to get to the larger piece as you go. So it's affording time, lots of people to support you.
That totally makes sense. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. Before we end the session, I just want to open it up and see, is there anything I missed or any advice you'd like to give to someone who's early in profession, maybe starting to go through these processes?
Sure. Yeah, maybe a couple of things. Once you successfully got through the interviewing process, definitely make sure that you're involving the people around you, because everyone wants you to be successful. So you have to kind of let people in enough so that they understand what you're thinking about, what you're going. It's probably my best advice. Going into the interviewing process, kind of two big things. Nerves are clearly part of it. But as I mentioned, it should be a collaborative partnership. And so the interviewer and you as the candidate would want to see at your best. And so anything you could do to kind of calm those nerves, it works. It's okay to let the interviewer know, maybe this is your first interview ever. And I've had many candidates tell me, this is my first big business interview. And, and I'll ask, is there something I can do to help calm the nerves? Maybe just take a minute, a little breathing, and that's okay. We're all human, and like I said, we want to see everyone at their best. And so just ask lots of good questions and be collaborative.
I love that. Yeah, I think nobody wants to have a gotcha. Nobody's looking to embarrass you. Feel free to be open about how you're feeling, and we really want you to be successful. So with that, Jeff, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I'm sure the people watching have learned a lot as well, and I really appreciate your time.
You betcha. Thanks so much, Katie.
Of course. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and pass it off to the next one. Thanks.
All right, thank you.